I'm really glad to see all of you. Welcome, Kees. Professor Kees van der Pijl teaches global political economy at the University of Sussex. He's not just a professor within academic environment. He's a professor who deals with ideas about alternatives in the society. He gives hopes to all of us that another world is possible. There are alternatives to the neoliberal world order. With these words, I welcome you to my university, to my department. It's time for you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, I'm really very glad to be here, and of course, I thank Babani for the kind invitation and the excellent organization. This man was already a legend when he was still a PhD student at Sussex, and I'm sure that he will have made his reputation here as well. Now, I won't be talking about him, but about Europe, about the crisis of the euro, which I think is very topical. And my aim is to give some structure and some background to how we must imagine the forces that are at work when we read in the paper these days that the euro might fall and Europe might fail, and you know, the German Chancellor Merkel has already made several threats almost that Europe would go down if something is not done about what is happening currently in Greece and Portugal. And because Babani always insists that I say something about a different world that is possible, I will also end by saying what I think should be an alternative strategy, because at some point, of course, it's not enough to say that we must fight or we must resist, etc., because people will do that as soon as they themselves are affected by the crisis phenomena, and these phenomena will grow worse, I think. But there must also be something positive, which seems logical and which, as it were, is already happening. And the peculiar thing about the current crisis, of course, is that there has been a response in 2007, 2008, which showed signs of going in a quite different direction from the standard neoliberal model. But within a year, that was more or less dropped. And I think that alternative strategy, which briefly announced itself, deserves to be called into our memory again and taken as a starting point for an alternative strategy. But I'll be brief on that because I'll need a lot of time to explain to you how I think the EU as a historical experiment and the euro as an experiment within that EU context fits into the wider global political economy, because that is essential. We shouldn't see it just in terms of the EU propaganda brochures about bringing peace to Europe, which of course was true in the sense that there was no war, but there was also something more specific. And we must also understand the very peculiar position of the United Kingdom within the EU. It's both in and out, and that is the first thing I want to discuss. So I'll talk about three things. Basically, one is the structure of the global political economy, from which we can draw some inferences that elucidate what the EU really is. And then I'll explain how I think the EU has developed. And it has developed, I can tell you now, in my view, as a French attempt to contain the inevitable resurgence of Germany. And the last action that France could take in this role was, because it could only perform this role as long as Germany didn't have its full sovereignty back, the last attempt that it made in this perspective was the creation of the euro. And that was in 1991 when that plan was put on the rails. And ever since, the EU has been in a way of in a sort of crisis, and when the financial crisis struck, that crisis has burst out into the open. And that creates a situation that we find ourselves in today. I'll just take my jacket off to move a little bit more freely. When we think of the international political economy, we tend to think of a world of states. At least that's how they taught me in school. There's a world of states here, and they have their sovereign, independent existence. And one way or another around that world of states is the world economy. You know, the relation between these two is always a bit difficult to establish, but I think it can be made much more specific if we look a bit at modern history. And this is a Western-centered history. It's inevitable because the West rules the world. And, well, it may take a lot down with it when it no longer does. What I think is very important to realize is that the English Industrial Revolution didn't happen because, and I can say that without apologies here in Scotland, it didn't happen in England because the English were such geniuses when it comes to technology and the application to large-scale production. The Industrial Revolution happened in England because already at that point, and when we're talking about the late 18th century, England had become the center of an intercontinental constellation from which it could draw the human and material resources that were necessary to be combined in the process that we call capitalism, which is the competitive exploitation of living labor power. There must be some definition here or there where we can read that again, but you see what I mean. There's a concentration on the British Isles. I say Isles in the plural because, of course, Irish labour power was very important to actually be transported to Lancashire, just opposite the Straits there. Now, the most crucial step that had been taken to create this intercontinental constellation, a step of momentous consequences, was that from England, if we take this as the British Isles, that from England there was a movement beginning in the 17th century of settlers to North America. And the settlers in North America did what the Anglo-Saxons had done when they conquered the Celtic islands in the British Isles themselves, and what English-speaking settlers would do again in Australia and in New Zealand, and that was ethnic cleansing. Drive out, marginalize, and in some cases, as in Tasmania for instance, really exterminate the indigenous inhabitants that they found there. The people who went to North America and settled there were mainly the Protestants, although there's a very intricate history there that would deserve to be talked about a bit much longer, but just for the sake of argument now, they were essentially Protestants. And they brought with them the idea that they were going to create a new Jerusalem. There was even a mythological story that the settlers who went to North America, by the way, via my native Holland, there was a brief stop in between, they considered themselves the 10 lost tribes of Israel. So there has always been this deep historical connection between the two tribes that actually survived from the old Israel and who today claim to live in Palestine, and the people who settled in North America. And although, of course, after that you've got enormous waves of subsequent immigrants from Jews from Russia, Germans, Dutch not to be forgotten in Manhattan, and so on and so forth, the fact that the English were the first to settle there, and a few Scots and a few Jacobites and so on and so forth, but the fact that the English were the first to settle there was important because they brought the language, and a language is of course not just a means of communication, but it's the vehicle that actually contains a lot of the experiences and the way people look at their state in relation to its society. This is an event of world historic consequences. I'm not revealing any secrets here that North America speaks English, but when they asked Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, what he thought was the main historic event that had happened in his lifetime, his answer was the fact that North America speaks English, because by this settlement and by making the culture that had developed in the British Isles the dominant culture, a world was created which was essentially based on liberal constitutionality. And let's not forget that liberalism and liberal constitutionality, which means that all government is handled in a spirit of society being a self-sustaining organism which you don't interfere with if it's not necessary, that liberal constitutionality is an absolute novelty. It didn't exist anywhere in the world before the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and Locke's John Locke, of course, was the ideologue of that movement, and it's still something that is very hard to export to other parts of the world. That's important to realize. But what liberal constitutionality resulted in was that whilst within a larger space in which certain commonalities were being reproduced, that is, society is self-regulating, the state should not interfere with the operation of society as such, the law should always be the final instance of governing social relations, and there should be this idea that every individual is a self-supporting entity who stands in a direct relation with God, which is the essence of Calvinist Protestantism. Calvinist Protestantism, again, is a fairly unique phenomenon. Of course, I should mention here that little Holland, my own native soil, played a very important role in many of these things, both in passing on the Calvinist gospel, passing on certain practices in the sphere of commerce, but also in the sphere of consolidated debt and handling such a debt through central bank, etc., without which the English experiment wouldn't have developed the way it did. And actually, of course, in 1688, as many of you will know, it was the Dutch Prince of Orange, the stadtholder of the United Provinces, who landed with a fleet 10 times the size of the Spanish Armada 100 years before to effect what was really a regime change in England. Of course, English history books will not tell you that it was the Dutch who created the Glorious Revolution or made that revolution glorious, because people like to remember their own history as made by them. But in this case, it was really an intervention by the Dutch, and the reason why that intervention was made, and don't fear that I drift off now into narrative history, but this is a historical juncture of extreme importance. The reason why that intervention by Holland was made was because it faced France, and France had defeated Holland in a very humiliating way in 1672, and the only way to prevent a repeat of an impending conflict with France, the France of Louis XIV, the guy who said, "I am the state, l'État c'est moi," the reason why the intervention took place was that only through regime change could William of Orange and the Dutch patrician commercial class ensure that the manpower and the land and sea location of the British Isles would be available for a future conflict with France, as it was in the war that soon after broke out. So this triangle is of considerable importance. But let me get back to the structure that we see here to the west of Britain, and which would later, of course, be expanded with Australasia, and some attempts were also made in South Africa, but it didn't quite work out. What happens here, what is the unique characteristic of this development, is that you see states which are nominally sovereign, but which are surrounded by a sphere in which the common constitutionality, and that means that for instance, an individual or a corporation or anybody who wants to settle a legal issue in Britain, in essence, can find a solution and a legal decision for that same conflict also across the Atlantic Ocean. That is what the commonality of liberal constitutionality amounts to. And it is this transnational dimension complementing the actual transnationalization of the people who crossed the Atlantic, which allows capital to develop. So capital is not a force which is present in a sort of abstract world economy from the start, although of course everywhere ships were sailing, credit was being extended, and so on and so forth. To function as a real organizer of the productive and reproductive machinery of society, capital must exist in a very specific form, and it exists in a form which turns it into a permanent extraterritorial discipline. That is, the capitalist system, if you want to call it like that, or capital in the way Marx used it, as a sort of collective social force, which is not empirical, only the separate capitals are. You know, you have Microsoft, you have any other capital, but they all operate in a certain similar manner, and the fact that they do that is a manifestation of the largely hidden reality of a capitalist system that's operating behind it. And Marx called that capital in general, or the social capital. But that's for the gourmets in these matters. It's not important for us. For us, it's sufficient to know that capitalism is not something that originates in a particular country, but it originates in the sphere in between countries, and it can really become a social force and crystallize into the dominant force in society when it can operate between different societies and decide, for instance, freely to move from one place to the next. And ultimately, it's the system of law that must be similar to allow it to settle in various places. That's also why in the 19th century a so-called Atlantic economy developed. And the Atlantic economy, according to economic historians, really means that whenever Britain itself was booming, the elements for that boom, men, money, well, men, women, and children, of course, money, resources, trade goods, and so on, flowed to Britain. Whenever Britain landed in a depression, and of course in the meantime the United States had become a separate state, goods, capital, and trade flowed the other way. That's the Atlantic economy. It's a sort of balancing mechanism, and that is how we must imagine that capital develops. Every state represents, as a nationality, the total catalogue of all the victories and defeats that within that particular state have been achieved by all parties that are involved. You know, if Marx and Engels say that all history is the history of class struggles, that one of the inferences we can make is that every nationality crystallizes, condenses that particular history in a particular way. That is why we have the NHS, and the United States, which I'm claiming here, is so close, constitutionally speaking, and in terms of its liberal makeup and mentality, has a completely privatized system. And that is because ultimately the state is the tunnel or the container in which particular struggles take place, in which certain compromises are achieved and legalized, turned into law. So they become, as it were, part of the national legacy. They also shape the national character. So when you read books about nationality, you tend to read that the nationality is a population which has a common history, it has a separate territory, and so on and so forth. But that's merely a reified way of saying that there's a long history which takes its particular shape and creates a particular form of humanity within that nationality. So the UK and the US, and Canada and Australia, etc., share language, share liberal constitutionality, but in every other respect they are different nationalities. You know, they will laugh at each other, etc. And still it's a sort of family matter. It becomes something quite different when we turn to the villain in the story, and that is France. Because whereas here you have what I call the Lockean heartland in the global political economy, but that's just terminology. It means it's a liberal sphere in which separate entities, separate sovereign states, are occupying a particular space, but around them is the space in which capital has its home. A capital which at the same time, of course, is active across the globe, but here it's really like as if you're looking at a big aircraft carrier. And all the planes are situated there, although they can fly, of course, in every direction after the last decisions taken by the government to have an aircraft carrier without aircraft. Maybe it's not a bad metaphor. That's again a completely unique constellation which began to take shape in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution and evolved over the 18th and 19th century into the present. And capitalism really has its home base here, even though it's developed elsewhere to a certain extent. In France, however, we're looking at a completely different process. France, in 1688, was faced with the growth of a sudden intercontinental constellation operating under a liberal, free commercial program. And the only way that the French could replicate this, arrive at the same outcome in terms of having a big fleet, having some sort of manufacturing industry, etc., was by turning the state into the collective subject of society. So everything which is here done on the basis of private initiative. And just think back of the role of the law, of Calvinism and all these things, individualism. With this separation, the structural separation between states and a transnational sphere in which capital operates freely and can circulate freely, although of course it has, like the plane from the aircraft carrier, it has to land all the time in these particular jurisdictions to be actually exploiting labor and exploiting commercial situations. In France, and France is the first here of a series of historical examples, in 17th century France, and you might say until Napoleon, it is the state which instead tries to mold the society under its control to achieve the replica of Western commercialized and later industrialized society. Even today, when we see the French trade unions in the street, you must realize that there is something fundamentally incompatible between the way the capitalist economy and the individualized liberal society took shape in the English-speaking West, and the way French society grew up, so to speak, in the last few centuries under the guidance of a state which is central, which absorbs all initiative and all intelligence from society into itself, and which from that concentrated, you might say collective brain of society then begins to mold society in a particular form. The greatest successes of France have always been achieved, and that goes until de Gaulle, until Sarkozy, even in a weaker form, when the state took control. That is why they had high-speed trains. When, here I must include the Scottish, you still had trains that you had to open from the outside. The French, of course, much mocked and despised in many respects, have a different culture in that respect, because a state is capable, by using certain planning mechanisms and certain centralization mechanisms, to make achievements which can never be matched by a liberal society, except in wartime. Because if you want to see what the English state, or the British state, and the American state, and so on and so forth, are capable of, you must look at the First World War and the Second World War, and then you suddenly see quite a different thing. Then it turns out that, even apart from the resilience of the population, these states too suddenly turn into states that concentrate all energy inside themselves and operate on their society as a powerful collective brain. Now this I call the liberal heartland, or however you want to term it. This I call a contender state. A contender state is a state which operates in the way I just explained. After France in 1815 more or less lost its role as the primary contender of the West, that is not a state which is deeply driven by the idea that it must somehow defeat the West or catch up or whatever, but simply a state which is so close to the powerful UK that it cannot afford not to have the same army, the same fleet, the same productive apparatus, etc., etc. Such a state must take recourse to its state apparatus to actually bring that about. After 1815 we get a sort of interregnum, and then of course the same is being repeated with Germany, unified Germany, 1870-71, in that role. After 45, of course, we get the Soviet Union in that role, and I would say that today China is what I call the primary contender. That is the state which finds itself in a situation confronting the liberal West, where it must match one way or another the results that the liberal West has achieved by this unique constellation, but yet has to do it by completely different means. And that is why these are state-led societies. And if occasionally, as in Germany or in China today, we see that the state class, the class which owes its commanding position to the fact that it controls the state apparatus and has sole state power, which it cannot share with others, which is why it's always very difficult there to pass the baton to the next generation, and there are always succession crises, a problem which is not existent in the West, because in the West, the capital, I would say, is the sovereign force, and the capitalist class, therefore, is the ruling class. And in these separate states, you simply have governing classes, and the governing classes are elected one after another It can be Obama in one round and it can be George Bush in the other, and still if you look a bit more closely, you see that actually little changes, except that the mood of the population is better represented. Because ultimately, yeah, it must come across to some of you a bit conspiratorially, but I must really tell you that after serious study, I can only come to one conclusion, and that is certain people are pulling the ropes all the time, and that is the capitalist class, which is not a monolith, by the way, because the same competition that drives the actual capitalist corporations also prevents the capitalist class ever existing as a monolithic social force. So there's a constant process going on of regrouping and pushing forward new solutions and new ideas. Well, this is my first, it took a bit long, but I'll promise that it will help us to understand what the EU is. Because if we say that this is the moment, 1945, when the defeat of Germany, and of course there's also on the other side of the globe Japan, which has an identical history in this respect, we're of course operating at a fairly high level of abstraction here, but if you want to understand the Japanese state, I can tell you, you arrive at the same things, that is a state in command and a capitalism which is very much driven from above and therefore incomplete, because it's not part of this free sphere and this liberal constitutionality where the similar structures of state-society relationships also guarantee that we talk about this one unified world of a capitalist system that guides the action of the individual capitals. If there's capitalism in France in this period between, let's say, up to the mid-19th century, if there's capitalism in Germany after 1870, and there was, of course, and in China today, it is a capitalism which is always something that the state can revoke and can manipulate. That is why China today is buying companies in the rare earth sector, for instance, in the United States, which also has a natural reserve of rare earth, you know, these tantalum and other metals that they use to make mobile phones and other gadgets, but also important industrial applications. China could buy a company because that company in the United States made little profit, and when you make little profit in real capitalism, you are up for sale. China didn't make profit either, but it bought that company, shipped it, demolished it completely and shipped it to China, and it's operating there today. That means that you don't have capitalism, because a company that can't exist in the United States, by that logic, if it really was part of the same world, could also not exist in China. But go back to 1945. The USSR becomes the main contender. That is the state which tries to organize its society with completely different means. That is with the state in a commanding role from above. And it faces a world which is composed of, on the one hand, the liberal English-speaking West, of course with my native Holland and Switzerland here as appendices, and Scandinavia, of course, we can talk about whether it belongs here or there. And with two states on the west, and of course Italy and the others are there as well, but these are the two important ones, with two states which are not part of the liberal West, but which have to be recruited as temporary allies in an attempt to recreate this relationship. And that is what the EU project that began in 1950 to the present is about. The attempt to create separate states which operate in a transnational sphere which is reserved for capital. But the particular conditions, now we're talking about the history of European integration. The particular conditions that existed in 1945 were imbalanced at the heart. That is, Germany, and that was West Germany in 1945, was always and would always be again a power superior to France. France, for reasons that are too complex to go into now, but France had always been unpopular with the English-speaking West for the simple reason that, let's say, it was the first contender. And already in that period, in the 19th century, deep antagonisms, deep cultural frictions had occurred between the English-speaking states and France. West Germany, on the other hand, was seen as confronting, of course, first of all through East Germany, as directly confronting the Soviet Union and its bloc. I hope you can follow me now, because it's interesting to see how European integration actually came about in this context. European integration began in 1950 with the Schuman Plan. And the Schuman Plan for a coal and steel community meant that was a plan to coordinate investment and create a common market in steel and coal products. And coal was because most of the coal mines were actually owned by the big steel companies. The coal and steel community was a response on the part of France to the decision taken by the United States, which in 1945, of course, had taken over the leadership of this bloc without actually breaking it up. But the decision of the United States was to rearm Germany against the Soviet bloc and the threat it was considered to pose. Also, the Korean War which broke out soon afterwards, played a role there. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to give a free hand to the German steel industry and to lift the restrictions that after the Second World War had been imposed on that industry. France at that point, and I'm not going to go through all the steps of European integration as you can imagine, but in this one first instance you find everything that we have had until the institution of the euro. France at that point decided that it was better to accept a West German resurgence, knowing that West Germany would always be the more powerful economic force facing them directly as the most directly affected rival state within Europe, but then at least to make sure that there would be a structure around France and Germany which would force the Germans to permanently negotiate the growth of their steel industry in this case with France. So what France proposed was a common structure of negotiation between France and Germany, and on that condition they were willing to allow the German steel industry and the coal mine output to increase. France in the process had to take some real blows because they also lost the Saar region, which is very rich in coal and so on and so forth. But these are details. The essence is that we are looking at the situation, I hope you can still follow me, where the English-speaking West is here, where the main contender, that is the state that is potentially in a fundamental conflict and represents an alternative mode of organization of state and society, is on the other side, and we're in between. There's this imbalance between a potentially weaker but temporarily powerful France and a Germany which is half between the West and the East, which is potentially the strongest one, but which is still without sovereignty. It's an occupied country. That, by the way, makes European integration completely unique if you compare it to, let's say, Mercosur in Latin America or ASEAN in Southeast Asia, because nowhere do you have the situation where the strongest state within a bloc begins the process as the defeated state under foreign occupation. And the reason why the Germans, who, let's say, economically speaking, would always have been capable of winning every economic contest with France, why they accepted a European structure of negotiation, was because that was, in their view, the only way to get their sovereignty back. So it was a constant to and fro between France wanting to create European structures of permanent negotiation and consultation, and Germany accepting that because they were hoping across that European path to get back to their full sovereignty. Now, it would be tempting, of course, to go into the second instance of the European integration process and so on and so forth. But it would also not be fair to just say, after that, everything worked according to this pattern, because that was not the case. There were other situations in which you cannot say that a major step in European integration was the result of France preempting a West German resurgence. There are more complex issues at hand. The fact that France wanted to bring its colonial empire into the EU and let Germany pay for maintaining privileged relations with that empire The agricultural issue also has a dynamic of its own. These were moments where France got more out of the European Union than my image here suggests. But I would say if you look from to the entire period from 1950 to 1991, when Germany was reunified and got its sovereignty back, then this is the overriding drive. Even the coup by which General de Gaulle became president of France. And one of the things that he did at the time was to lower the French wage level in order to allow France to compete. Even those events have something of this structure, of France trying to match Germany and to draw it into a particular European arrangement, so that almost like a baby gorilla which clings to its mother's belly. That's a bit of a big image, of course, to when you think about France. But France was riding with more powerful Germany, and that became a more and more imbalanced and unequal situation. And as I said at the outset, the last step that France took in this sense was the moment when the West German mark, again, by the way, the Dutch are always riding with the winner, and the Dutch guilder, I should say. But when the West German mark was becoming the dominant currency in Europe, and all countries around it, and of course in the meantime the UK had in 1973 also joined the EU, but that's a different story. When all the countries around it were faced with this strong D-mark currency, and had to choose either to, well, not in every case, but let's broadly say either to devalue and make their exports more competitive, but also their debts, of course, more expensive to service when they were to higher currency areas, or to repeat what has so often been done, and that was to create a European structure, and that gave us the euro. The euro is the outcome of the fact that Germany, nearing the moment, actually coinciding in 1991, nearing the moment when it regains its full autonomy as the most powerful state in Europe. And let's not forget 1991, of course, is also the moment when the USSR collapses. All these things are part of one historical process. But at the moment when Germany is about to regain its full sovereignty and its full power, and of course after that it will be looking at its own issues very, very strongly, because it had to arrange the reunification with the industry and the economy of the East, which took it 10 years or about. The last moment, France proposes to have one currency for the whole area, but basically what they had to concede at the same time was that the conditions under which this currency would operate were essentially a reproduction of the conditions that had been created by the strong Deutschmark. That is, the currency would tend to float upwards. It would be a powerful currency, would be seen as a currency that would compete with the dollar as an international reserve currency, but also allow companies from the Eurozone to expand abroad through direct investment. Except that there was one, and it would harm, I should add, it would harm exports, but not of Germany, because Germany again occupies a completely unique position when it comes to global export patterns. Germany exports heavy machinery, the top range, turbines for power plants, that sort of medical equipment, goods for which it really doesn't matter whether you pay a million or 1.5 million euro for a unit. But also even its consumer goods, consumer durables like the Mercedes and the BMW. I can assure you that although my own means of transport are more modest, I can assure you that somebody who wants to have a Mercedes or a BMW doesn't say, it's 5,000 too expensive. So even in that range, the German export products are so much sought after that they can be, the German companies and the German society can be indifferent about the value of the euro to a considerable extent. And even if it would harm, and where it harms its export prospects, or the export prospects of the economy as a whole, it can compensate that by direct foreign investment. Germany in the early 21st century has had over many years an export surplus in spite of the high euro, which well outstrips the export surplus of China. So every day we read in the papers that it's China which is flooding the world with cheap goods. Yeah, that's correct. But Germany is flooding the world with expensive goods, and it's more successful in doing so than the Chinese. Now there are people who say, how is it possible that in the current crisis Germany again has picked up, whereas Greece and Portugal and all these, and Ireland of course, are all in trouble? Well, the explanation for that is extremely simple, because Germany's exports are not affected by the euro, but Portugal's and Greece's and Ireland's are deeply affected by the euro, because the products that they make for export suffer massively from the high value of the euro that has been the result of West German dominance. I hope you're still with me here. So that's the situation that we are in today. What is interesting now is that, as I said at the outset, the original aim, but then is bad for conspiracy theory, because aims are never realized, certainly not in the form that they were intended to, the forms that they were intended to bring about. The idea of the European integration was to extend this liberal sphere in which capital could move freely between different countries. Everything that the EU has done, especially after 1991, was actually to turn this large structure into something like that. It's amazing to see to what extent the EU Commission and the EU institutions have been neoliberal, that is committed to privatization, to marketization and liberalization. If you compare that to the traditions of the separate member countries. All these member countries are always running behind the actual EU regulations and institutions. And that is because the EU Commission has, as it were, taken up the historic mission of an expansion of the liberal West. Whereas the states here have to deal with their population and with the real frictions it would bring about when such a neoliberal program would be instituted. Again, I can refer to the strikes and the demonstrations in France, where you see a society in revolt against something which for them is absolutely unacceptable, and don't believe anything about that pension age is only going up to 62, etc. The real reason why the people are in the street is because you have to have worked 40 years before you can get a pension, so it doesn't matter that that 62 is set as a separate age, because to get at 62 you should have started work at 44. But anyway, that's a detail. The point is that when the European integration process was completed, in a sense, in the sense of France trying to cling to Germany and to control its resurgence, which from the start was considered inevitable. And the memoirs of Jean Monnet, the father of Europe, very interesting guy, by the way, investment banker in the 1920s and 30s, somebody who knew how to manipulate the books in that only today is becoming apparent. If you read the memoirs of Jean Monnet, you can read explicitly that that was his program. That he said, if we don't cling to Germany, France will be swept away, but there's also a risk that Germany will look to the east to get its sovereignty back. So they were aware of the actual bargain that they were entering into, and successive politicians have looked at that as well. Now, one thing that I have to mark my time here. One thing that we must, that's the last part that I want to present to you. One thing that we must understand is that in 1973, of course, the UK plus Denmark and Ireland became members of the EU. But England, or Britain, has never been part of this particular arrangement between France and Germany. Also, it doesn't have what France and Germany have, this history of a contender state in which a state is in the driver's seat. It is the historical center of something completely different, and that is the liberal constitutional West. where capital has its origin, as I explained earlier. This has very deep roots which have shaped the outlook, the mentality, what people expect, and so on and so forth. And that explains why, in the course of the evolution of the EU, whether we look at the agricultural policy it had to take on board when it became a member in 1973, to the euro, Britain has this unique position of being in and being out. And that is what the most intelligent, not always the most pleasant, but what the most intelligent politicians and their entourage were immediately aware of. And when Margaret Thatcher went with her waving her hand back to Brussels to renegotiate Britain's membership of the EU, basically what she was coming to say was, we are part of a different world than you ever have been. We therefore don't want to be part of these compromises. We don't accept this structure, pan-European structure of constant negotiation. And let's not forget, there's a European Parliament, there's a European Court of Justice, there are European trade unions, there's a European employers organization, there's a European Roundtable of Industrialists, extremely influential body of European capitalists and top managers. That sort of transnational negotiation structure, quasi-parliamentary structure, is completely absent here. There's a NATO parliament, there are a few of that sort of institutions, but they have nothing to say. Because here you have the pure liberal situation, that is the free West is for capital and for transnational population and money movements, and everything that is democratic and about negotiation and about class and social compromise is firmly contained within the state. And there's no way that a state like that would ever allow, or would want to, if it can resist, transnational or supranational arrangements to penetrate its reserved sphere. And that is why, apart from its use as a populist scaremongering device, there is always the fear in Britain of the European superstate making Britain do things, etc., etc. So that's history. But now, and that's the last thing on this, why is Britain actually supporting Ireland? And I read in the paper somewhere, is already bringing funds together to jump in when Portugal might need an injection. And they will all need those injections, don't worry about that, because as I said earlier, Germany is happily booming in the situation of a strong euro. All these other countries are suffering massively, and this was predicted by everybody who knew something about it long ago, because they can't be competitive. And you even get the absurd situation where a euro is worth more, if you want to go to a restaurant or something, in Berlin these days, than if you want to buy a meal in Naples, where you are in a poor surrounding and where it looks really like a Mediterranean place, but with your euro you can't achieve so much as you can. And that is a sort of perverted form of devaluations that these societies have had to swallow. But if you then look at the wages that are being paid in Germany and Italy, then you can begin to think and to understand why people at some point will come out into the streets. But Britain is, in many respects, the architects of the whole euro enterprise. And that is important to see. That is why they're willing to stomp up when it threatens to go down. Because Britain, of course, like the United States, but they are not a member of the EU. But Britain in the EU wants to pursue this ideal of a liberal free trade zone. That is why they were the ones who wanted and still want Turkey in today, whereas France and Germany are against. I'm not talking here about racist sentiment and xenophobic responses, but the pure economic logic is that in a liberal setting, the more the merrier. You know, Baltic states, fine. Romania in, let them come, because that means market. But if you look at European integration from this historical experience, then of course you're talking about very intricate compromises which have to take some institutional form. And in that light, free movement of people is a highly disruptive force, and free movement of capital the same. now I should give Babani his due, and that is my alternative. The current crisis, and there's no time to go too much in that, but I think that if you follow the newspapers, you will understand that at some point banks began to trade the collateral they had in the form of a right to ownership, or right to reclaiming the ownership of a house that is mortgaged among themselves, and they also began to turn those collateral documents for mortgages into documents which contained the collateral of a serious mortgage, that is a house that will be repaid, a property and a debt that will be repaid, with debts that would not be repaid or had a slim chance of ever being repaid. And these so-called collateralized debt obligations began to be traded because everybody needs something to allow further lending to go on, and that has now broken down. So the banks are, as all of you will know, the banks are the real culprits here, because they have taken an aspect of the process of lending and borrowing into the realm of pure speculation and gambling. And once somebody begins to become distrustful of what's going on and what's actually contained in these collateralized debt instruments, then of course the whole game breaks down. It's a bit like at school when we had a system that you have to give, you have to send a card to 5 people and to ask them to send one Dutch guilder to the name that was on the top of the list. That's what you call a pyramid scheme. And everybody wanted to be part of that because we heard of somebody who actually got 50 guilders out of this whole thing. Except a pyramid scheme has the peculiarity that the longer it lasts and the more widespread it becomes, the less and less money actually comes back. And this is exactly what has happened with these collateralized debt instruments. The banks, therefore, are effectively bankrupt in many cases. You know, the reason why Britain has to step in to help out Ireland, as you have heard in the news, is not because Ireland is broke, but the banks are broke, and Ireland doesn't want to see its bank go bankrupt. Now, my alternative project is not a wild utopia. I have those as well, but they can be discussed later, maybe in an informal moment. But it's simply to go back to 2007, when the governments, also the governments of the UK and the US, took major stakes in their banking apparatus for the reason that I've just sketched. Basically, the banks were bankrupt. They were saddled with so much unpayable debt and fraudulent paper that they couldn't function anymore. So I would say that what is necessary is an immediate nationalization of the banks. It can also be, in this context for instance, a Europeanization of the banks, because we shouldn't rush into the mistake of thinking that everything is national. That's a typical liberal illusion, whereas there are other parts in the world where the national context is not necessarily the best to actually socialize things like a bank. Of course, RBS and Northern Rock, really a rock of speculative fraud that you wouldn't believe if you look into the details. Of course, the manager got out with a handsome bonus payment, nevertheless. But these were nationalized to a considerable degree, except that the government, the Brown government and the Obama government in the United States, behaved towards these banks as, well, let's just say, a girl on her first night out, you know, very fearful and frightened of and shy, and not in any mood to take steps to actually reorganize the role of the banks. And I think that is exactly what has to happen, because let's not forget that when we talk about crisis today, we're always looking at 3 different crises which aggravate each other. One is the crisis that I was just talking about, which is simply the fact that the capitalist economy has become a machine for speculation and private enrichment, which has completely run out of control. So that has to be brought under control, and the best thing to do that is to nationalize the bank. But the second crisis, of course, is that we are looking at what I would call an exhaustion of the natural and social basis on which the capitalist economy or any other economy would rest. That is, we have overfished the planet, we have destroyed and contaminated the atmosphere. We've done a lot of things that I'm sure you're all aware of. it's not just the tiger that's disappearing, it's actually our life chances and the whole pollution of the biosphere that we're facing. And that means that if the governments would step in and take real managerial control of the banks, they would have to do that with a program. And that program, I think, should be, and again, there was brief talk about that when General Motors, for instance, went bust, or almost. Obama was talking about creating a new type of auto industry which would produce low carbon cars. Again, something very soon forgotten afterwards. But I think that should be the real program that the banks should be instructed to execute. That is to begin lending in the direction of a carbon neutral, sustainable economy. And the last crisis is, of course, a crisis of the fact, and well, this image already gives you some sense of confusion, I hope. But there's an enormous confusion, of course, in the world. There are states that still represent alternative models. Of course, post-Soviet Russia has never become a fully liberal state. It's still very difficult to classify, but China is very much a contender, state-controlled contender state, and the potential for violence, therefore, is enormous. So the third aspect of a reform program, I think, must be the taking of urgent steps towards disarmament. The level of armaments has reached absurd proportions again, and there are certain states like Israel operating with a license again from the English-speaking West, basically, but especially from the US, of course, which are creating mischief in the Middle East to an extent which absolutely cannot be tolerated and which carries the risk of enormous conflagrations. So again, this is in honor of Babani, but my program for an alternative would be nationalization of the bank, but then real nationalization. Turning the banks into the levers for creating a carbon neutral economy, and item 3, the creation of a world of much lower level of armaments, essentially only defensive weapons to defend our holy soil against brutal intruders. But that would be my last item, and this is the alternative which follows, and I hope you have followed me from the analysis I've presented here. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kees. Always inspiring, as always. This is time for question and answer.
Yeah, I'm interested that you're saying that basically the euro is a cunning French plot. Why do you think the Germans went along with it?
Well, I wouldn't say it was a cunning French plot. It was a step in a long tradition in which the French, confronted with the situation, they realized they wouldn't control if it would continue, looked for the second best solution. And the reason why the Germans went along with it is, well, A, because they went along with it, but B, because they said, we are willing to do that if the euro effectively consolidates and reproduces what the German mark does now. And let's not forget that, and that is a strong currency, rules for not running high deficits. Let's not forget there were very tight rules attached to the European, or to the Economic and Monetary Union in terms of budget, limits to budget deficit and limits to inflation and so on. And these rules, of course, meanwhile all have been broken, including by Germany itself. But they looked at the time as Europeanizing the German way of looking at the level and the management of a currency. And that is not, as you sometimes hear, because they had the terrible experience of the inflation of the 1922-24 in mind, but simply because a strong currency is very much in their favor today, history or no history. Yeah, meanwhile, of course, and I would also concede that there is some element there of a genuine European mode of thinking. Of course, there have been two earlier attempts in which Germany tried to organize its own European space, the one ending in 1954 or 1945 with 50 million people dead. So the Germans are not crazy and realize that it's best to seek an economic way of allowing their country to and their economy to expand. But I always tend to think, maybe because I come from a small neighboring country, that Germany is too small for the world, but too big for Europe. And that's the problem that we're all faced with. This is a super machinery at the top, at the level of the capitalist firms. And let's not forget that at the same time, the German population is impoverishing to a very considerable degree. If you look at the figures, the rise of people living under the poverty line is quite remarkable for this so-called success story. So it's not a Wirtschaftswunder in any sense anymore. It's the German capitalist machinery which functions at top speed, but which operates really on a global level, and which has left very much its own particular society behind, apart from picking out the best workers. And even there, this is an irony that I just read in a journal that I was reading on the way, that of the 100,000 construction workers currently working in Berlin on all kinds of projects, only 23,000 are Germans. All the others, so we're talking about 75,000 other construction workers, have been imported by companies who are not based in Germany, and who, by bringing in workers under a different company legislation, therefore can also avoid German co-determination legislation, which gives the workers and the trade unions a vote in how the company operates. So yes, it's a French initiative. You can even see that in the fact that in France and Italy especially, the euro is always popular. It's still something that the French will not openly agitate against. In Germany, it has never been popular. That's why they always avoided a vote on the issue. Because of course we don't want democracy in every area of life.
Yeah, can I add in? I don't disagree with the notion of the contender state. I think if you take France and you take the dates that you're looking at, I think you need to add into that Algeria, because it's the 19th century French economists are quite explicit that they see the extension into Algeria as part of creation of that territorial space. Yeah. And if you take the dates that you give of kind of 1815, okay, the invasion of Algeria is 1830, but if you take 1815 and you end with, say, 1954 and the early 1960s, then that's when France has to pull out of Algeria. And if you, say, take the whole long line of French economists, French policymakers, who go to the United States during the 19th century and are putting forward that as an explicit model, then you could argue it's the failure of that attempt to create that neoliberal space in terms of Algeria that pushes and forces France to look east to Germany.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You might even go further back and say that when Brits went across the Atlantic, the French did the same, you know, from Saint-Malo and places like that. They also settled in North America, except that in the 7 Years' War in the late 18th century, eventually they lost all their colonial possessions, and it was only owing to the Jesuit order that Quebec remained as a French-speaking part of Canada. But basically Quebec is the last remnant of what should have been a new France, just as there was a New England. And you're right that Algeria, even when de Gaulle let it go, that was still mortgaged by the idea that French companies then would have access to the gas and oil resources in the south of Algeria, in the Sahara. But otherwise, there's nothing to add, it's right. And plus, let's not forget that, of course, if history was only so simple as to be explained in 3/4 of an hour with on one blackboard, then of course we wouldn't even be sitting here. We would be singing and dancing in the street. As soon as we look at one of the elements that is depicted here with in more detail, of course we tend to. That's why my story works best with people who know little about.
Following on from that point, I'd like to ask about a little bit more detail in relation to the UK's role as an awkward partner, which is a bit of a cliche when you look past the rhetoric and the perspective from political integration, you talked about institutions and the misfit between UK liberal institutions and the European system. But there are a lot of political science studies that look beyond the rhetoric and see how the UK has adapted institutionally, and also how the EU sometimes admires the policy processes, the adaptation and the fit of the UK's institutions. And I just wondered to what extent maybe you could take them into consideration, because it seems a bit of I know you're working at a level of abstraction here and looking from an economic perspective, but there's a lot of detailed studies that suggest institutionally, you know, the awkward partner label doesn't really work anymore.
The what label, sorry?
The awkward partner label. For
Yeah. Well, no, I think that this legacy is not so easy to dismiss. You know, that it is true that Britain is the origin of the liberal West, at the origin of the liberal West. But at the same time, of course, the fact that it was defeated economically in World War II, although part of the victors, and had to cede the primacy within the English-speaking West to the US, has made it more receptive, so to speak, to the structures that were proposed from Europe. So there are important changes. Well, I mentioned the NHS at the beginning. The NHS was a compensation for, I would think, but there's a specialist here who knows more about this, but the NHS was very much a compensation for the fact that through 2 world wars, British people had, of course, suffered enormously, and therefore were, you might say, almost entitled to a measure of socialism in their society, and that took the form of a number of collective provisions, and this was one of them. That was a sort of concession that didn't have to be made in the US, which came out as the economic winner of the Second World War. Yeah, there are other examples. In a way, for instance, one of the reasons why Britain initially refused to be part of the EU was not because of its liberalism, but because of the fact that it thought of itself as a more socialist nation. So, for instance, the trade unions didn't want the nationalized British steel industry to pass under a European regime of controlling investment, because they thought that that would be a step back for Britain. So in that sense, we're always looking at, you know, this is a sort of unilinear historical image. Everything goes forward and so on. But in fact, we are always looking at situations that are not only more complex, of course, than I present them here, but also contain elements that go forward and elements that go backward in fairly unique proportions. So you cannot say that Britain, for instance, was always, as I suggested with the trains that you open from the outside, that it's always the backward country. That's not the case at all. In several respects, it was in the 1950s, for instance, still an industrial leader in a number of areas. If you just think of the warplanes that they were producing. The Gloucester Meteor, for instance, for those who were still aware of those miracles. I mean, these were world-class products, just as still today. Of course, there are certain sectors of British industry like Glasgow and well, Rolls-Royce had a bad last month, but normally speaking, we're talking about a world leader in industrial precision. And when I made my first jokes on arriving in Sussex in 2000 about the backwardness of England, you know, it's a form of provincialism, of course, of thinking that you think you can make that judgment. People explained to me that some of the French cars that I was mentioning as examples of French prowess against British backwardness had actually been designed in Britain, engine and all. So in that sense, we are always looking at societies, and that's one effect of the freedom of capital to migrate. We're always looking at societies that are losing their homogeneity in several respects. So there are backward pockets and there are most advanced pockets in one territorial entity. And that also goes for the institutional side that you mentioned. So Britain takes up certain things, but on the other hand, let's not forget that they have an exception on the work rule, working hours agreement, and they have other, and they're not in the euro, but at the same time, of course, advocating the sort of policy that a euro in its let's say, German Deutschmark version and the regime that it imposes is very much something that the British want to operate in that way. And so because a free trade zone, of course, functions most smoothly if you don't have to change from Baltic floods into Polish zlotys and to et cetera, et cetera. So a currency union connected to a free trade zone, if you're not interested in the social consequences, is the best solution of all.
I don't necessarily disagree with the whole thing. I'm just
No.
thinking that the political institutions similarity that's going
No,
on.
that's exactly right. But there also you must see that the totality of legislation of every country is, as I said at the beginning, a catalogue of all the outcomes of social struggles that have taken place in that particular society. And if you are, that is why British society ultimately is different, much more different from Holland, for instance. To my surprise, I thought we were all liberal friends, but that's not the case. Authority, for instance, means much more here than it would ever be in Holland. And that is because the state played a much greater role in settling all kinds of conflicts in Britain, but also accounting for its successes from the Tudors onwards.
Any other questions?
We're not really hearing very much from the left, though, in relation to nationalising banks, and perhaps we're talking about green banks and green investment banks. There is some talk in relation to that. I just heard it yesterday in relation to Glasgow North East getting a manufacturing base for wind turbines, just announced yesterday. And people were saying, well, this is perhaps how we should be looking at our banks to spur these kind of investment in these areas and so forth. But we're not really hearing any coordinated plans in Britain or across Europe to look at turning this banking crisis into a catalyst for rethinking a greater sort of distribution of wealth, and I'm wondering if that is as a result of our recent history as well, that the collapse of communism is recent memory. And the reasons for the collapse of communism are recent memory as well: restrictions of freedom, corruption, bureaucracy, stultification. Stultification. And to think in terms of nationalising banks on a massive scale is a step that even those like Gordon Brown, for instance, and Alistair Darling, no doubt in the 70s could only have dreamt of as socialists in those days, when they actually got the opportunity to do it. It was for the purposes of saving the capitalist system's financial integrity and value, rather than with a view to constructing social policies to expand the distribution of wealth and so forth. And perhaps that's just something that we're going to evolve into, perhaps by watching the Eurozone reconfigure itself, as the Germans almost certainly are going to get fed up with bailing out other countries, and other countries are presumably going to think, why are we doing this anyway? Why are we in this league that we can never advance in? Just wondering what your thoughts might be in relation to that perspective.
Well, very briefly, the Germans will not get fed up with bailing out other countries, because what they're bailing out is their own banks. It's the credits made by Deutsche Bank and Dresdner Bank and Allianz to Ireland that have to be guaranteed, and that is why these grants are being made. There is no charity involved, I can assure you. Plus, that there is a price to maintaining the whole of the Eurozone. I mean, the threats of that Chancellor Merkel is making about the end of the Eurozone would mean the end of Europe and so on and so forth. She even said a few weeks ago, the peace of Europe was built on European integration, and if that integration breaks down, the peace will go as well. Now, of course, if you think of Yugoslavia and of certain problems in societies breaking up like Italy and Belgium, and it's not entirely unimaginable that might reach levels of violence. And I'm also thinking of the terrible events in my own Holland, where the largest party now is an anti-Islamic party which builds, which is helping to build a momentum that at some point might also begin to create a really ethnic cleansing-like situations. France has already adopted a law, which by the way is completely illegal and unconstitutional, that people of North African origin can be sent back, even though they were born in France, when they commit offenses. I must say that I'm not entirely sure whether this is already a law, but it is a project that Sarkozy has launched. As far as the left is concerned, I think that is, we shouldn't forget that the thinking that markets will always stabilize themselves, which is at the heart of the Western liberal tradition, the idea that society is a self-regulating organism which works best when you don't interfere with it, that idea has sunk in so deeply through generation after generation being taught in universities and these days also in schools where they also get economics, that it's very difficult for people to imagine anything else, especially if, of course, the one experiment that could have made the difference has disappeared from the map. I mean, when I was a student, and somebody would have told me that the Soviet Union would disappear, I would have smiled and recommended light medicine or I don't know what, but it has disappeared, and you know, we can discuss whether Gorbachev maybe arrived 2 decades too late or that sort of thing, but basically it failed, and the impact, the black hole that has created in the minds also of people who in principle would be willing to consider some sort of alternative. I mean, how can you talk about the planned economy in any serious sense? Although, well, I won't talk too long, but one thing I want to mention, that just before Allende was brought down, it's also a compliment to British thinking, by the way, very briefly before Allende was brought down in 1973 in Chile, a group of British engineers, cybernetics engineers, had gone to Chile to help to make a contribution to setting up a new type of economy. And what they wanted was to create a planned economy, which was not a command economy, but was based on a cybernetic system in which proposals to do something are sent to faraway places, and you would then get back the results and the problems that would create, etc., so that there were constant feedback loops from the center, getting back relevant information. And these cybernetics people were actually using a network of discarded telex machines for that purpose. And I think it's a fantastic experiment, and Allende was so impressed by it when he saw it being demonstrated, because it would also take into account when a strike was going on, so there was no production, so that he proposed to bring that whole center, that planning center, into the presidential palace. But of course that was one of the many things that went down in September 11, 1973, let's not forget.
Any other questions?
Yes, please. If you were going to speculate, what is, given the history of Europe and what is in America, I think what you have given us is a sense of what history has done. If you were going to speculate what is likely to become future history, for following the big financial crisis, which effectively has shown that a stabilizing society doesn't exist, and if we assume it exists, it collapses, And on the other hand, if we have a constructed society, planned society, that also is bound to collapse. Both these two ideas, extreme ideas, appear to me to be, at least empirically, shown not to work. And then, following that, do you think, my personal view is because we really haven't understood how society works.
Yeah.
And yet we haven't got a theory of how economic theory actually, how it all works. And it is because of that, and whether we are going right or left or whatever, we can't manage it. It's like we have a machine, we don't know how it's working, and then we only discover how our body is working when we have pain here or another one in there. And when we try to do some surgery, we may get something else wrong.
Yeah. No, I entirely agree. I had a friend in Amsterdam who was an Ethiopian, and he profited from when Ethiopia was still a Soviet ally. He had done 2 PhDs in Moscow, and one was in physics and one was in social science. So he had the right to speak where I should remain silent because I'm very clumsy with mathematics, etc. But he told me that in his honest view, after having done a PhD in each field, that social science ultimately is more difficult than physics, because he said if you know mathematics and you know the basics, then you can do anything in physics, although some people will be better at it than others. But society cannot understand itself for a host of rather obvious reasons. Plus that we are constantly reproducing, and all of us working in university and any level of education are guilty also of that. We are constantly reproducing views about society which are manifestly untenable. Most theories being taught in academic courses are a version of systems theory. Now, a system works fantastically in any organism, but not in society. The idea that anything is self-stabilizing, etc., is a horrible illusion, because it means that you actually don't. It's best to not to interfere.
Study it, forget it.
Yeah. So that means that there's a lot for us to do. No, we should. Yeah, I honestly think that the responsibility of intellectuals for everything that's happening today is enormous, and that a sort of willingness to accept, ruling doctrines too easily is absolutely well. I don't want to use words like criminal too lightly, but it means a level of complicity.
Oh, absolutely.
We must. If in the in the so-called capital debate, talking about economics, the capital debate with Joan Robinson and these people in the 1970s, it was established that the neoclassical economics rests on central misconceptions, which are logically completely untenable. That became in the radical 1970s became a big debate, and at some point Paul Samuelson, the Nobel, it's not a Nobel Prize, it's a prize of Swedish Central Bank, it's a different matter. He won a big prize in economics. He wrote a standard textbook for economics. He conceded that
Absolutely.
it was true.
Yeah.
That he said, yeah, it's based on, but he said we shouldn't look at it in a too fundamentalist sense. No, okay. Today that's all forgotten.
Yeah.
And everybody, let's not forget that whereas an economist might still be willing to talk, let's say, academically about these matters, a politician who has had one course of economics or 2 or 3 and remembers that markets will always stabilize themselves and so on and so forth, he or she is not in a position to question that. There's no time for that. So society routinely reproduces these misconceptions. And it's not just in economics, by the way. In all modesty, some way of looking at international relations also leads you to quite different understanding of the historical specificity of what the world is made up of, and what every part of the world, and let's not forget, where's Latin America, where's Africa, where's India, all these areas are still left out of consideration, but that's because this story, which is fairly recent in world historical time, begins in this breakaway between Europe and the Atlantic West. But that too must be understood much more specifically, whereas in international relations everything begins with the differentiation between idealism and realism. Realism is every state is on its own, and idealism means we're all part of the international community. And that is also a false dichotomy. That dichotomy cannot be maintained if you think about it, because the West was always in command when international relations was formulated. So it adhered to international community, whereas the rest was encouraged to be separate nations so that the West could more easily play with it. I mean, simplified, but that is... and I think there are many other fields where the basic assumptions on which the understanding of a particular section of the world is constructed on are faulty or problematic. And there is something else, and that is that the whole disciplinary organization of social science but also natural science. For instance, the guy, what's his name, of the Gaia hypothesis, James Lovelock, writes in one of his books on Gaia that the reason why climate change was discovered so late was because physics is also divided in all these different, you have geophysics, fundamental physics, etc., etc. And that sort of, and I think that ultimately the disciplines of academia are actually the ideal way, not entirely intentionally, of course, but that's how they have come to function. But they are the ideal way to maintain the class discipline or social order that we all live under. Because if we only know one segment of how reality functions, how can we ever grasp the things that we must know to understand that the world might need a sort of, well, a clean break doesn't exist in history, but some sort of rupture so that we can move into a different era. And in terms of the existential threats that we face, we are on such a threshold and must come with something. It's not ambition or so. It is once you begin to think of what is confronting us, we cannot just sit here and think, well, what will my pension look like? Because it may be that the threats it faces are much more fundamental and have to do with the very survival.
Yes, I have two questions. The first is, what was the nature of capital within Lockean heartland, and how that nature was different from nature of capital in contending states? And the second question is, was it a monolithic capital within this Lockean liberal heartland, or it was dynamic? And if it was dynamic, then what was the labor division within capital, within Lockean heartland?
Yeah. Well, that would require, but it's a good question, because before you know it, you think that this is a sort of monolith which always comes out winning and smiling and defeats everything before it. In fact, of course, the capitalist economy has constantly been reconstituting itself. But the interesting thing is that the dynamic of that process has always come from the West. So I would think that the major change that you can see in capitalist history is the moment when consumption becomes the axis of capital accumulation. So that on the one hand, we are being de-skilled, that is, we lose some of our craft abilities and become more reduced, so work becomes more tedious and repetitive and so on and so forth. Not for us, of course, directly, but for the mass of the population. And at the same time, they are being compensated, and that is possible thanks to the productivity increases obtained in that way. We are being compensated by consumption goods. And of course, everybody knows that story that in the old days people wanted to be something, and today we only want to have something. So we're surrounded by people who are chasing, having a Range Rover and a holiday here and a holiday there, and still there's something missing, so you get a sort of deep dissatisfaction, which explains why 1 in 10 people, adult people in the UK, for instance, are on some form of sedative. Because life is not giving you what you want to be as a human being. So the realization of your human possibilities are too restricted. Now that change to a consumer, a mass production consumer goods society occurred in the beginning of the 20th century. It was generalized in the New Deal of Roosevelt, and it came from the United States. Some elements of that were also, Germany, because of its technical prowess, was also an early player in the so-called rationalization movement. But the state and all what Gramsci calls the whole infrastructure of the pensioners of history, the presence of old-type intellectuals and church, etc., was too heavy, that weight, and you didn't have that in the United States. So the US has always been the dynamic force of capitalism. Same with the mobile, with the laptop computer and the PC and all these things. In that sense, we can't say the US is a big rascal in everything. At the same time, it's the laboratory which produces all these innovations that give a tremendous, open up tremendous new possibilities. So capitalism as a system is constantly renewing itself and must constantly be reconstituted, and that is why it needs this free space. You know, if social conditions here become non-conducive to that sort of innovation, it must move. It must be able to freely move elsewhere. On the other hand, the whole idea, as I said, of capital is a competitive reality. So we can only assume it operates behind the reality of the different firms which compete with each other. And it's the same with its class power. I've written a lot about class, and at moments of great despair, I sometimes think I still don't quite understand what I'm actually talking about. And that is because class is about a fundamental relation which practically always is covered by more visible and manifest forms of bonding among people. So for instance, if you think of the 18th and the 19th century, you can speak of a rise of the bourgeoisie in England and France, US of course. And, but the bourgeoisie would never call itself the bourgeoisie. It was organized in networks like Freemasonry, for instance, which was you might call it that today, is just a means of getting a cheap second-hand Volvo. But in those days, it was the transnational party of separation of state and church, party of modernization, the party that believed in science and so on, and hence its symbols. So in that sense, class is a difficult issue. But I would say there's a capitalist class which also constantly reconstitutes itself through a process of organization that we see happening at the very top levels in organs like the Bilderberg Conference, the Trilateral Commission, the World Economic Forum, where also young people are brought in to groom them for a role as future managers or etc. And then there's, of course, all kind of divisions between the people who own a lot, who simply sit on a mountain of money, and a group of people who believe in the efficiency of this system and in the futility of trying anything else, and who therefore are the dynamic elements. Because usually it's not the real capitalists who sit on the billions who come with these innovations, but relative outsiders. Just as the English Industrial Revolution, by the way, was practically all the work of Jews from Germany, Belgian steel makers, etc., etc. You have to be a bit outside an established order to be a dynamic element, I guess. And that goes for the capitalist class as it develops as well. But here, maybe, in all modesty, I can refer you to the works that I've written on this score, and where you probably can see how I'm struggling with that idea, except that I would always stress, and that I'm a bit confident because my book on the making of an Atlantic ruling class, which was my first book in English in 1984, is actually being brought out again next year. The point that I always emphasized, and I think that comes not so much out of any genius on my part, but simply because from Holland the world looks like that. The point I always tried to make was that the capitalist class is a transnational phenomenon. It is not something that can ever be locked up, bottled up in one state. And my experience is that for a German and a Frenchman, and well, less so for the English-speaking people, that is simply a bit silly, you know, because the capitalist class isn't in Paris for a Frenchman, and it's in Bonn or in Frankfurt or Berlin for a German. And the idea that a class could ever be relatively outside, of course they can't be swimming all the time, so they are here or there. But if, for instance, you look at the history of the English-speaking ruling class, then you see that people like the Astors and those families were constantly moving in between these areas. This is such an important axis, you have no idea. Even Cromwell was, and his Protestant fundamentalists at the time, they were people who moved in between.
Ireland and Greece, and all the states are going to fall into that mechanism, support mechanism.
Oh, I don't know.
Maybe
I have one copy here from the Financial Times from a few days ago, and they basically say that most of the banks in the Eurozone, apart from including the Germans, most of the banks are actually bordering on bankruptcy. So we are, and these are the people who know, or should know. So we are in a situation where probably within the next year, we'll get some very spectacular bank failures. And then it will depend on how people respond. Also how trade unions, for instance, and I hesitate to say left party because I'm not immediately aware of any except Die Linke in Germany. And in Holland we also have the Socialist Party, which is a sort of former Maoist, in fact, Social Democratic Party. But whether they will then press for and come with a sort of recognizable program. But don't forget that in the 1930s, when Keynesianism, for instance, came on stream as part of this same turn to consumption-oriented capitalism, there was a fear among the ruling classes that capitalism was not a given, because at the very same period, the Soviet Union, in an almost terroristic mode, was going through its first 5 years plan and showing miracles to the world that had never been seen, turning an agricultural country into an industrial one. Today, of course, that threat is so capitalism at that time had to take drastic steps in order to secure its survival. Whereas today, of course, there's more complacency on that account, and I would almost say rightly so, because where do you see even Chavez, who has in Venezuela, who has the army, and basically he's forced to take all kind of petty authoritarian measures because the ability to gain control of a society like that is too complex these days. Borders are porous, etc. So, but I think it's not a bad idea to come up with this nationalization of the banks. If you add to that they then must also do something, which is in the interest of a new type of economy. And since there was brief talk of that, I think it's not entirely utopian.
So do you see a two-speed euro?
Well, that if they only had thought of that before and listened to the people who actually said it is not possible to have a monetary union if you don't also consolidate all budgets into a single budget and you create a single state, basically. Because that would have removed, it would also include a complete free movement of capital and people across that space, and that of course would be very problematic. But they could have thought of a euro that one would have been called the euro, and the other something with Mediterranean in it, the Medi, and then the Medi could devalue against the euro. Not that devaluing a currency is actually a very beneficial step. It means that everything from the outside becomes more expensive, etc., etc. But talking about the future, and that's one thing I should say, because I was so struck when I read that myself. What is currently happening is that, and that is why the governments are returning after brief hesitation in which nationalization was being considered. Why they are returning to neoliberal platform with further privatization and liberalization. That is because, and I got this journal from somebody, I'd never looked at it, Globalizations. It's called issue of this year, double issue 1-2. And it has a brilliant article by Saskia Sassen and an article by Patumaki, and both say, coming from quite different angles, the same. And that is that there are new mortgage markets, and I should say subprime mortgage markets, waiting to be exploited. And that is China, India, Turkey, Iran, and a number of others. And what they both predict, coming from quite different angles, is that after this crisis, there will be a resumption of the extension of mortgages to countries and populations and sections of the populations that actually can't pay for them, and that it then will that will induce a new boom of around 10 years, and that in somewhere around 2020 we would get the definitive boom. Now, I don't think history works like that, because usually when something like that is in the offing, and the fact that you can write about it today means that the people won't, just like mice in a treadmill, act that scenario out. But I do think that there is the mortgage market is much more important than I ever realized. There was this famous book by Hernando de Soto, which is called The Mystery of Capital. You can buy it for a few pounds in Amazon. And it's really worth reading because he's a friend of Bill Clinton, etc. It's that sort of guy, former top figure in the IMF. And he says the third world is sitting on some $9 trillion worth of real estate. But that real estate is not being mobilized as part of giving mortgages, selling and buying it, and so on. It's simply the work of a father of the family and a few brothers who build that house for themselves, etc. And he says if we want capitalism to really have another boom, and he wrote that some 10 years ago, I think, we want capitalism to have another boom, we must exploit those markets, we must make all this ownership mobile. So mortgage banks should move in, and legislation should be adapted in such a way that people are more or less forced to take a mortgage on their house, otherwise they can't pay certain taxes that would otherwise be imposed on them. And the figures that Saskia Sassen gives in this article are quite remarkable in that respect. That in China, India, Turkey, Iran, there's a very limited percentage of people who actually own their house on that basis. So there's a vast potential for growth. And I think if you combine it with this the Soto article or book that I read separately, yeah, I thought that I saw some contours of what we may be in for. But then I think that assumes that the Chinese state class would willingly allow Western mortgage banks to come in and begin to operate that sort of system, which we now have seen ends in chaos and dispossession. And there, I think, international relations and or geopolitics, however you want to call it, will intervene. And the world is not only made up of economic processes, it's also a matter of prestige and the passions of nationalism, etc., that can come into play, and societies that defend their way of life against other forms that they find are alien to them.
I think the debate can continue forever, and
well, not all parties agree.
In the beginning, I did not want to stand between Kees and his speakers, so I did not say anything. Kees, I'm proud to have a teacher like you. You will remain as a comradely teacher forever, and if you locate his lecture today and his latest book on modes of foreign relations and political economy, you will see his commitment for the people and the society around the world, that provides the hope that there are intellectuals who work for the society, work for the people. They don't form a class with Lockean heartland, but with the people, those who live in the Lockean heartland. Kees, thank you for your time. I'm sure you all will join with me. Thank you, Kees. We have a movie to watch where we can explore the ideas Kees was trying to explore. And it's a movie by Oliver Stone called